Thanks very much for coming to this panel called Scoring a Documentary in 2015, Live Musicians versus New Technology. I'm Kate Townsend, I'm the executive producer at BBC Storytell, and I was just saying to the guys, this is not my technical area of expertise, so forgive me if I'm asking very obvious and ignorant questions at times, but hopefully that will be the perspective of some of you. We were kind of curious to know, first of all, before I introduce the panel, how many of you are composers and more from the music side here? Okay. And the rest of you are directors and interested parties. Great. So let me first introduce the panel to you. We're really, really fortunate. So I start over on this side of the panel. We have Brendan Woithe, who you did your first composition at the age of, you had your first release at the age of 8, is that right?
God, someone's been looking at Google.
I do my homework. Great nose. Is that right?
It is, yeah.
Yes. And you're a very broad field. You do composition for documentaries as well as soundscapes like Google and other.
Yeah, I work with Google Labs. I work in contemporary dance, all sorts of different fields. Anything where there's a story, I get into. It doesn't really bother me what form it takes. Yeah.
And you've got quite a unique workflow, haven't you? Is that right, that we're going to explore a bit later?
Yeah, I have a number of different ways that I like to work, which is slightly non-traditional. Yeah.
Good. All right, more about that later. And over to my right here, we've got Patrick Jonsson, who was the composer of the amazing documentary that was Academy nominated last year called Virunga. Welcome. And you've scored other documentaries, shorts and features before.
Yeah. Both features, fiction and documentary, kind of whatever, like Brendan said, has a good story to it. And yeah, I just love working to picture. Yeah.
Great. Good. And now we've got this side is the director's side. So we've got Ed Perkins here, who did many. You built your career up, didn't you, doing shorter films and behind the scenes with some of the Man on Wire and the Passion Pictures films. And now you've moved on to your first feature documentary, Garnet's Gold, which we showed, which did incredibly well for us, and still winning awards, isn't it? You just won an award this month,
in Dockville, actually, which was quite fun.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And your film is incredibly musically driven, as we'll find out. We're going to be looking at clips of the films. And over to the far left here, we have Orlando von Einsiedel.
Close enough.
Is the director of Virunga, which opened, I think it was Tribeca, wasn't it? It was first screening last year, and then obviously went on to great acclaim, shortlisted for the Academy last year, and has now been available on Netflix, and enjoying great success there, and at festivals too, isn't it?
Yeah, it's doing it's kind of got a renaissance because we're doing a big African tour at the moment, which is what we always wanted to do right at the beginning, but various different things stopped it happening. So it's doing that. It's having a new life.
Have you been out to Congo then?
Yeah, last month it went on national TV, and then actually it went on TV on every African country, which was fantastic. We wanted to do that right at the beginning, but then there was a whole load of security concerns after one of the film's main characters got shot. So we held back on advice of everyone on the ground in Congo.
Good response?
Yeah, really positive. Really good. It's always interesting when you have other kind of government departments in neighbouring countries tweeting about it in the right way. So it's good.
Well, I mean, yes, we'll talk about music really, aren't we here? So let's go back to music. I mean, the panel is really, what we're going to do here is just touch briefly on the history of music and documentaries, just outlining through the key highlights. And then we want to really dig into the experience we have at the table to take us through questions of how the tension points and the demands between live musicians and new technology, whether the new technology is opening up creatively new opportunities or creating new challenges. And obviously the most important thing for this table is the important relationship between the directors and the composers, really. So maybe before we see any clips of anything, Ed, I can ask you, I mean, how important was it, the choice of, this has been a passion project. You've been working on this film for a long time, haven't you? So talk, just out with me, how important was it for you to find the right composer and how you went about that process?
It was really important. I mean, we actually first met here in Sheffield at the meat market 3 years ago.
Oh, yeah, I met.
And you didn't recognise me. Apparently, I've aged very badly.
Oh, me?
I've
Yeah.
got a beard and all the rest of it. So it's been about 4 years in the making, and I reckon for about 3 of those, it was just kind of me and a Canon 5D Mark II, just kind of up in the Highlands of Scotland making the film. We didn't have money for most of the film's life. And it was quite an isolating experience. So when we did eventually, the BBC came on board and we started ramped up into production and then into the edit. One of the things that was amazing for me was actually kind of collaborating for the first time with other people. So instead of just me and my subject matter, Garnet, kind of out in the Highlands, it was suddenly me sitting with composers and sound designers and editors. And for a young filmmaker, I think that was really great because the last kind of 10 years, there's been this kind of democratization of the process, I think, with like very affordable, cheap cameras like the Canon 5D. It means that you can just go off and make films on your own, which I think is amazing. It's meant that films have been made that would never have been made otherwise. But I think there's also a risk, which is that just because you can make films on your own doesn't mean you need to make them solely on your own. And for me, the post-process, being able to collaborate with a composer in this case I think it was one of the most interesting parts of the process, actually. And I think I learned more through that short amount of time than I did kind of working through a lot of stuff on my own in the sort of lead up to that. Okay, great. Well, we're going to dig into the process a bit more because I think most people here seem to have very different approaches to the process itself. But Orlando, can you just talk with just broadly what you look for and what you were looking for in a composer and in that relationship?
Well, bizarrely, I've actually hardly worked with any other composers other than Patrick, which is I guess because it's always worked so well. Yeah. I guess I've been very fortunate in that we met about 5 years ago on a short film I made about a skateboard school in Afghanistan, and I'd actually worked with a musician. He was more he wasn't a film composer, and I found the whole he did the original score for this short film, and I found the whole process a real nightmare because he had a lot of, I guess because he was quite an established musician, he brought a kind of, I don't want to say the word ego, but
ego.
Yeah, but he had a different way of doing things, and it didn't really gel, the final kind of score that we had, and the commissioners, the people that paid for the film, they were also really unhappy with it, and Patrick was there just to do the mix and the sound design, and he said, "Oh, do you mind if I have a shot?" I was like, "Okay, brilliant,
yes.
let's see." So
I scored the opening scene and sent it over, and you liked it.
And yeah, it was brilliant. And I from my experience of the little experience I've had working with other people, I think you want someone who's very giving and very open for feedback. And I've just found that a really nice way to do this. I mean, obviously, you want that in every aspect of filmmaking, I suppose, but especially in the music too. And yeah, so it's kind of worked great.
Yeah, to follow up on that, the great thing about working with Orlando is that the feedback that he gives is exactly the kind of feedback you want to get as a composer, which is he'll explain to you exactly why he thinks that something is or is not working, and it's very easy to adapt things from that point of view, as opposed to this is not working, but not having any clear reason why, sort of taking the gut feeling and turning it into something intellectual that you can explain. And I think we have kind of a similar aesthetic that we go for, so it's worked well.
So is that quite forensic and detailed, or I mean?
It can be, but often it's a bit broader than that. It's, for example, this isn't giving me enough of this feeling, or it's doing too much of that and not quite whereas I want it to be doing this. And then it's my job to go and translate that into a musical language.
I think it ends up forensic. In the end, it's like this is a beat or two wrong or what have you. But at the beginning, it's much more kind of broad brushstrokes. Like this needs to feel a bit. This is the kind of feeling you want from either the whole score or these scenes. Yeah. And it's more you're talking about emotions and stuff. I guess that's what we do. And then we boil down to instrumentation and stuff like that.
Okay, well, we're going to pick that part a bit more later because we want to go a bit more in detail through the process of how you work. Brendan, what are you looking for? Just to ask them what they're looking for in composers, and what are you looking for in directors, and what's your ideal, relationship you have with the directors that you work with?
The more collaborative things are, I think, the better it tends to work, and that involves communication both on the emotional side, as you were talking about, for someone to tell me what it is that they are looking for in terms of the feeling, in terms of the arc, and the arc isn't always obvious, especially what a director wants to push forward, and it might not quite be coming out in the edit at the time that you're looking at it, especially if it's in an early cut stage and that sort of thing. So if you can talk in emotional terms, as a composer, I can feel that stuff and communicate that through the music. And having frank discussions about aesthetic as well, and generally a director or whoever the creative is that you're working with will have an idea of your aesthetic before they approach you, or at least someone's told them a little bit about your aesthetic. And so discussing the bits that they like about that and the bits that they don't like, and that can come down to instrumentation and things like that. But I tend to try and get that stuff out of the way as early as possible, and then get into the nuts and bolts of what the story is about and portraying that as much as possible. And yeah, there's a beauty in the minutiae as well that comes towards the end, and I really enjoy that. But emotion and story first. Yeah.
Okay, well let's listen and take a look at a few examples now. Well, I think we've got Virunga, just the 2 clips before we go into the history timeline. So should we take a look at Virunga first, a small clip? I'm so ignorant about this process, but how long, Patrick, did that take you to compose?
I work quite fast because we spend a lot of time on the emotions, like we were talking about, and once we
just talk us through the process of that.
Once we come up with the thematic material, then it becomes much easier, and that was probably the 3rd or 4th draft. I remember we had something quite different to begin with, and what we were doing before was still had that grandeur and all that kind of thing going on, but I think what it was lacking was a bit of the earthiness of kind of what ended up being the park theme, which creeps up throughout the film. And it was kind of a light bulb moment. It's like, oh, obviously it should be that as soon as but we had to go through this process in order to arrive at that point first. The trial.
I was going to say this, that scene, the film follows kind of 4 main characters, but one of the characters in the film, aside from the kind of humans, I wanted to get this idea of the park being this character, this living, breathing entity, and so that was the kind of sequence which was meant to kind of suggest that. So the song, the piece of music for that was really, really important, and as Patrick said, it was the theme song of the film effectively that would then you'd kind of resonate down the line in later sequences. Because
it's what we're trying to protect in the film, and we need to have that resonance.
Yeah.
So that was incredibly important. You were saying, so you would have heard the first draft, did you? And then you had discussions about emotionally how true it was to the story you wanted to tell.
The weird bit is Patrick actually sent me a first draft of that song, and I really wasn't sure about it because I knew this was going to be one of the key things that would resonate in lots of other cues that we do later on. But I just kept listening to it, and then, I think when it works when you find yourself humming it a day or 2 later. You're like, oh, okay. That does work.
And it was almost too quick because you shouldn't be finding stuff so fast.
It was too easy to find it. I think that was why.
So the first draft was pretty similar to that.
I think it pretty much was that. Yeah.
I mean, I had been tinkering around a lot by myself first before I sent something to Orlando.
It wasn't that easy for loads of the other tracks, but just that particular one.
Good. Okay, let's move on to show a bit of Garnet's Gold, and you can maybe talk us through a bit of how you reached from this. That has obviously elements of soundscaping as well as music in that clip, and that was a very powerful theme in Garnet's Gold, using the elements as well as the music. And can you just talk through who you worked with, J. Ralph, and how you came to reach that balance?
Yeah, of course. So just to put that clip in context so it makes a little bit of sense, the film, I'm not sure if anyone's had a chance to see it, but the film basically follows this very eccentric man called Garnet Frost as he goes on this kind of wild, hapless adventure up into the Highlands of Scotland in search of buried treasure, the lost gold of Bonnie Prince Charlie that is reportedly worth $1 billion. But the closer he gets to the gold, the more elusive it becomes, and his search turns into something more personal, a search for kind of meaning and purpose and love. And that scene that you saw there kind of happens. I'm giving away the only narrative plot point really in the film, but once he goes and he doesn't find the gold, he then needs to kind of reevaluate what the hell he's doing up there and why he's brought me along. And he has this moment where he's on the side of a lock, and there's this kind of tempest sequence. And after experiencing the storm all around him, he then goes out into the water, as you see there, and dives underneath. I met Josh Ralph through Simon Chin, who produced the film, and Josh is a very well-known and respected documentary composer. He composed the score for Man on Wire, and is a bit of a legend. And I was in New York and I met him, and he. We're going to see some photos later, but he lives in this amazing kind of studio underground in the Lower East Side, and has this kind of enigma around him. And I went in and met with him and talked about the idea for the film, and it's quite an abstract idea. The storyline was quite abstract, and the approach I wanted to take was quite kind of ethereal and sort of suggestive, rather than kind of cinema verite. And we talked for about 2 hours, and what I thought was really interesting was that I wanted to try and tell the second half of the film with as little dialogue and verite scenes as humanly possible, just as a kind of challenge to myself. So often with these kind of follow observational documentaries, characters are talking to each other, and I wanted to see if we could strip out the talking and try and take people on the journey through imagery as well as through sound design and through music. So we kind of set ourselves a challenge that for the last half an hour of the film we would have basically no dialogue. Apart from a little bit there and a poem at the end, the last 25 minutes is basically silent. So we challenged ourselves to try and tell the story through sound design and also through this music. And I thought it was a really interesting challenge, and it was something that Josh got very excited about. So for example, that scene there, we use this kind of allegorical imagery of the storm, the tempest, where a man is kind of confronting his demons. And then we have him wandering out into the lake, and that was kind of a sort of baptism, a rebirth sequence. And then we have him walking to the top of a mountain, and that was a sort of ascension. So these very kind of classical sequences. So there was elements there of kind of slightly kind of organy, sort of slightly churchy music going on, that sense of kind of baptism and stuff. I found working with Josh kind of amazing, and we never talked about instruments. The only thing I ever said was I didn't want bagpipes. But apart from that, we went in and we spoke for 2 hours just about story and about Garnet as a person, and he's got a really kind of a very kind of like attuned narrative mind. Right. He's a real genius. Doesn't read music. I don't want to speak for him, but I don't think he can read sheet music. I think it's just he just kind of plays. And when I first met him, he was just kind of sitting on this grand piano in his house, and he just kind of sort of invited me in and started playing these notes, which turned out, I think, to be the first notes of the film. And it just kind of all just came out. It was very kind of instinctive.
Yeah, amazing. Yes,
really
he's one of the greats, isn't he? So we'll move on to the process in a bit more detail later. Orlando, I just realised that I'm assuming everyone's seen Virunga, and I don't think they have. So maybe we should just tell people a little bit about what the film is about.
Okay.
Very eloquent job, Ed, with a Garnet's Gold.
So Virunga, in the simplest form, it's about the battle by a few very brave individuals to protect the Virunga National Park, which is Africa's oldest national park, and home to the last of the world's mountain gorillas, against an oil company and a civil war.
Yes, an astonishing film, so you must see it if you haven't seen it. We're just going on to a little sort of lecture section, aren't we? And which is the timeline of the history of sound. So yes, here's the timeline. I mean, I can read this out to you. Would it be best to read it out to you? I don't know. 1890. So this is really how over the last 90 years from the early silent films, how it developed. The first documentaries, there's Actuality, 1900, sound film, public exhibitions, 1919, there was the piano schools. Yeah, and the Nuke of the North was no sound, but amazing seminal film. The first commercial screenings of films with sound, 1923, and Grierson coining the term documentary, but still the sound was still very tricky there, wasn't it? They had those massive sound systems outside when Grierson was doing his work. The first talkies, 1921, in Germany by Tobias Filmkunst, documentary called Melodie der Wald, Felt. Motion picture with recorded sound and music for the first time. So 1950s, Cinema Verite explores new technology, synchronized sound. First multi-tracks, 1955, multiple recordings with experimental sound and music scores. Now, 1959, this is really moving on to, obviously, the Pennybakers and Maisels. Remember those amazing first films? I mean, it's a bit later than 1959. They actually devised it, didn't they? Which is why, is it on the next? Oh, it's not, gone massive leap. Well, Pennybakers, they did the first portable sound, which enabled them to do, what's the film called? What's pardon? Primary, which was allowed a real intimacy and the first time to really capture observational filming as we know it. Okay, this is getting technical, this bit. For me, 1980, Fairlight. Does anyone know the CMI Series 2? I really think, Patrick, you should be reading this. 1980, MIDI is developed, allowing computer-generated techniques for school production. 1989, first accessible digital sequences for personal computers. Creator C-Lab is launched for Atari. And then more computer-based editing programs such as sound tools and sound designs. So multi-track digital audio workstation, 1994, called DEC. Is this making sense to you too?
So these are all taking closer and closer to
what we have today. And in fact, what the last one is essentially exactly the same as what we're using today. We're using digital audio workstations that are entirely based off what was happening 20 years ago. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right, good. Is that it? Are we
yeah, that's it.
Phew. Oh, okay. But there were obviously some really key moments in that, but the digital has been a huge breakthrough, hasn't it, in the last 10, 15 years. We're going to just have a clip. There's a montage clip of 3 documentaries with sort of, you know, well, in 2 cases, well-known soundtracks. In 1 case, a well-known documentary with a modern soundtrack. You'll see which one I mean. So can we run the montage of scores? Great. Well, I think you probably all recognise the first one, which is Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris, which was the Philip Glass score, which in itself has become a bit of a cliche over the years, but I mean, an amazing, astonishing soundtrack. The second one was obviously Nanook of the North, but that was a composition from 2014. You can see it was a new live score by Josep Luis Galeana and Avelino Savadre. And obviously the final one was the amazing Nick Cave documentary that came out last year, 20,000 Days Under the Sea, which if you haven't seen, you should go and see because it's quite astonishing. I just want to ask this question to this side of the table, really, which is, I mean, how much easier do you think all these new technologies and digital advances have made the creative process for you? Or do you want to answer that, Brent?
That's a good question. I think new technologies have meant we work in different ways. I wouldn't necessarily say one way is easier or not. You know, you're still coming up with an idea. And coming up with the idea, to me, is always the most difficult bit. Technology comes into play with production, I guess, more than anything else. And also enabling you to quickly have an idea reflected back to you rather than, you know, dots on a page where you relied, you know, old school scoring where you actually have to listen in your head to how you think things will come out. So it's changed things. I think it's changed the immediacy that people can feed back on stuff. It's changed the immediacy of how you can communicate your ideas quickly to other people.
Demonstration of your ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, and that idea of what is a demo compared to a final, and when demos become finals and people get attached to things that even as a composer you're not necessarily happy with, and all those sorts of things. So yeah, not necessarily easier, but it's just changed, and it's something that you always have to adapt with as you know, people bring new technologies to the table. Yeah.
So talking about speed and obviously cost as well. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, working with samples, for example, is of course more cost effective.
But still expensive. People
Is it?
think, oh God, yeah, I would be spending 5 to 10K a year on software and hardware to run this stuff all the time. And
what, just updated?
oh,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Staying up to
yeah.
the latest
Right.
technologies as well.
Yeah, and that's a part of budgeting that people don't necessarily realise is the actual cost of maintaining a workstation that can do everything, and the expectation that you can just pull out any sound at any time. Yeah.
And a modern part of composition is to actually combine live instruments as well as samples, and it's a big part of today's working method. I'd say for most people probably is there are certain situations where samples can add something that you might not necessarily be able to get with real instruments for budgetary reasons, or just because you're used to hearing a certain way because we've been living with this for 2
expectations of
months.
Yeah.
And Alfred, do you think there's any drawbacks? I mean, because you're talking about that sort of, very, instantaneous, you've got an idea, you bring it out. Is there not something to be said for a slower creative process at times?
Absolutely.
Before you're immediately getting feedback that requires some longitudinal thought-through process?
I think it's tempting to just get started.
Bang it out. Yeah.
Just get started and just start producing and just make it, as opposed to spending the time just watching the film.
Yeah, and conceptualizing.
And
sometimes
thinking.
it's hard to get that time back, and give yourself that time when people are shouting at you because they've got things quickly in the past. And it's always nice to, at least try and get a little bit of extra time so you can breathe a little bit and let the idea seep in. It's ideas generation. Composing is ideas generation, and it is nice to have time.
Yeah.
I think also the idea of what a sample is depends also. Like, for example, at the beginning of most projects, I'll create a toolbox for myself of sounds that I can send over to Orlando, and he can use that in the edit, for example. And the guys in the panel yesterday were talking about a similar thing, that you can have these sounds that are samples, but you've recorded them yourself, or you've compiled them from existing material, or you've gone out and recorded live musicians. So technically they're samples, but they become a part of the creative process, and there's an overlap, I suppose.
Yeah, a sample being a demo, is that the same thing?
Sorry, when I say samples, I mean pre-recorded sounds that are intended to sound like, for example, a violin or a cello.
Which aren't synthesized.
Yeah.
So the difference is, I guess the first part of technologies was when people were trying to synthesize sounds, and it was sort of the project of the 70s. A lot of the time was to, and the 80s was to provide synthesizers that sort of made sounds that are kind of like it. And then sampling came along, which is where they actually get, for example, a violinist in a room, and they get them to play the same note, in some cases hundreds of times and in slightly different ways, and then that's fed into a computer program that we can then play back and get very close to the sound of a real violin through it. And in some cases, even a feature score I produced, we recorded a full 60-piece orchestra, and we ended up using some sample library things underneath it as well to beef up the sound, just because of the expectations around what we think a Hollywood score sounds like, and the producer wanted on this particular project, and that's fine. But yeah,
because an orchestra might not necessarily sound in reality the way we expect it to sound because of what we've heard in films.
Yeah, the cultural expectations associated with what an orchestra actually sounds like is often different to what an orchestra sounds like. Which is an interesting thing come mixing time, and someone comes into the room and it's like, really? That's what that sounds like? It's like, well, yeah.
These samples are what we use to send the demos over to Ed in Orlando, and that's what they hear, and then they'll hear the final instruments later after the recording process.
Right, got you. Good. Okay, that's clear. Now, what I thought we'd do now is just get a bit more forensic with each of you about how you work, and dig into a bit more about the demos and the samples and how you work. Maybe we could start with you, Brendan, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
So we've got, as I said, you're quite broad in the palette of how, the types of work and commissions you take on, don't you?
Yeah.
And at this bit, we're going to listen to something that's called Skin, isn't it? Do you want to introduce Skin and just explain what the brief was for you?
A project almost without a brief. It was a director who was introduced to me through an editor, and I actually work very closely with a lot of picture editors. an aside to this project, but I was introduced because of the aesthetic of the type of thing I do, and I met up with him I was over in London and met up with the director, and we just had a talk about the project, and the project is about an art project to do with tattooing and getting a number of quite famous artists to design tattoos and then have those tattoos onto people selected by who were asked to sort of approached to be on the documentary, my brief to it was basically to do the type of thing that I'd done on a couple of other projects in terms of the sound. But then we just sat down and really spoke about the aesthetic and got right into the world of tattooing and what it meant and how that might affect the sound and the music. And then it was just basically me running with that and throwing ideas out and feeling different ideas. And the process of the sound and the music all happened at the same time as the picture edit. And in fact,
just unpack that a bit more, what you just said, because that's what you do, isn't it?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time in edit suites with a full workstation, working with the editors. You know, sometimes I'm in a corner with headphones on and don't talk to them for ages, and other times I'm there and we're actually experimenting with things and seeing how changing something in the music changes the edit, and maybe even getting the edit slightly changed in order to work better with the music and the sound, and it can be a slightly longer process. A lot of the time it's not. There's a few editors who I work with that have got very used to it, and it's a very powerful thing, and you can design arcs, and you can get, you can go into a lot of minutiae that way. That's quite interesting.
There's not many people that do that.
I don't know of anyone else doing it at the moment.
But would you do that for the whole score, or you would dip in and out of the edit?
Dip in and out. Yeah, absolutely. There's always the case of wanting to go into your own little box and producing stuff and coming up with ideas. That will never go away. And that particular way of working tends to work better in short form. But in long form, in this particular case, even though I wasn't in the room with the editor every single day, we were, because I was on a different side of the world once it came to the actual production side. But every day over the entire edit, we were having, hour to 2 hour long Skypes and throwing ideas. We were constructing part of the story in the music because we treated the voice in a very different, quite musical way, and I got to construct a lot of the story with raw sound files of the voiceover and move that around and actually work and mould that into the music, which was extremely interesting.
Okay.
Sorry, it's confusing, but yeah.
No, it's not confusing. It's just that's a lot.
It's a lot of process. Yeah.
A lot of process and a lot of editorial contribution. If you talk about moving, I don't know, as we have directed, moving bits of sync around.
Yeah, a lot of trust in that case, and I got that through the very first scene, and I did, I just happened to hit what the director really wanted. When we constructed the first 3 or 4 minute segment of it, and then it just ballooned from there. It was great. Yeah.
Well, let's take a look at, I think we're going to take a look, there's 2 bits of music, which one is, the first minute is the demo. Yeah,
the first demo of the piece, and then the second one should be of how it ended up after we recorded some live instruments.
And just to be clear for someone like me who's ignorant, when you're saying demo, is this what you the
very first musical idea that I threw, to the director, saying this is what I'm thinking for the score for this area.
Okay, so these are back to back. Let's have a look at them, or hear them, and look at them. Great. Well, yes. Well, it's obviously different, isn't it? But also, you can just it's still there. The essence of it.
The essence of the idea is still there, but it did change a fair bit when we recorded it live. So the basic music of that part, which is just the drums and the piano, were recorded as live, as a live session. And even though the piano's treated, and we were treating the piano live and doing some crazy things to the sound of it, just by nature of it being a live performance, it changed things a little bit, which was really nice.
And what do you think that live element brought to it? Do you think you could have used the original?
Not in that case. I mean, that demo would have been done really quickly. Like, I probably ended up, aside from the idea, the actual demo would have taken half an hour to throw together. Whereas if I was going to be doing that using electronic things, it would have taken a good half a day or a day to get it sounding a little bit. It's always difficult using real instruments that are samples and trying to make them pretend that they're real instruments. And it takes a lot of time to do that, and it's something I prefer not to do. So in that case, it's not a difficult thing to get a drummer in a room and record them, and a piano in a room and record it. So I much prefer to do that when possible.
And they bring something as well.
And they totally, I mean, when you're performing live and you bring an emotional feeling to that performance, and the idea of performance in what we're doing as composers plays a big part as well. And even though it's a subtle thing, I think it definitely comes through in scores when it's played by live people who are breathing, and that just the nature of it being a performance means that there's other meaning that comes out in the piece. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I mean, and just moving on, Patrick, to your work, just picking up on that point about live music. I mean, how important is it for you to have the live musician element in the final mix?
For me, it's very important. It's something I always push for whenever I'm having budget talks with Orlando and saying, like, what's possible, can we stretch it a little bit further to get these players. And sometimes you might be going just in the electronic directions, and then that's not a relevant conversation. But if you are trying to make sampled instruments sound like real instruments, then it's definitely worth thinking about at least getting some live players involved, so you can kind of cheat the ear a little bit by layering real players on top of samples sometimes.
Right.
But of course, if you can get all live players, then you have a room full of musicians all moving in the same direction, each performing slightly different with their own imperfections, which you could absolutely never recreate by yourself on a keyboard. Even if I perform it 100 times, it's still me performing. And the sound qualities and the way the room behaves, it's just something that I think we can all feel instinctively somehow, but it's hard to describe. I think we just feel it somehow. So for me, I like live musicians whenever I can.
I think we're going to, is this clip we can see of the
Yeah, this is an example actually.
Yes, would you like to introduce it?
I'd say listen out for particularly the string sounds and the percussion sounds. So the percussion sounds in the demo and in the final version are both samples. So
we're about to listen to the same, a demo and the final version back to back, yeah.
So the percussion are the same, so you'll hear that doesn't change a huge amount apart from the mix in that it gives a bit of brightness. But you'll hear there's a solo viola towards the end, and I think there's a noticeable difference from the demo to the final version. There's dialogue in the final version, so you'll have to listen through the dialogue a bit.
Right, let's have a look then. It's a clip from Virunga with the two comparing tracks. Beautiful.
So hopefully you can hear the difference in the two clips there.
And just talking about that clip, just taking us through, how, you're saying the first clip we heard was kind of straightforward. That's a similar motif there, isn't it? With
as the
yeah.
very first
yeah.
clip. Yeah, exactly. That's the park theme.
Yeah.
So this is the last scene in the film. So we wanted to. This is kind of the biggest, where the theme is played out in its basically full version. And actually, this is one of the only times where we re-edited the picture to fit the music, which is amazing that Orlando was willing to do that, because I think it worked a lot better.
What did you do? How was that being cut?
We extended it a little bit because one of the phrases was being cut short and it felt a little bit unnatural, and because the music seemed to have less impact, it was worth doing that.
we were a couple of, I think we were a couple of bars out in the technical speak, right?
Yeah.
It just didn't quite all gel.
Well, maybe we should just talk about that whole timing process of when, how much time you allow for the composition of the music, and as you said, to what extent that starts influencing the cut and the pictures. So, Orlando, how did that process work between? Did you stop the edit and then, send the cut over, or was it doing it scene by scene? Just talk through a bit forensically at what point Patrick became involved.
Oh, I think I first spoke to Patrick right at the very beginning, so Patrick had to wait about 2 years before he could actually do anything properly.
I couldn't tell anybody about it.
When I first sort of started making this film, I just got really excited, and I started trying to find everyone who might be able to work on it much later, but it just took a long time to make. But I don't know how you necessarily work, Ed, but the first thing we do is we sort of lay down guide tracks, and they're just stolen from other films and or other just good
That's
music.
You and the editor without Patrick.
That's me and the editor without Patrick. And then the conversation then with Patrick is these guide tracks sort of roughly set the feel or the tempo or one, have some sort of emotional element. And then we talk a lot more about, the story themes and deeper emotion of the whole film. And then he goes away and does the first kind of sample ideas, which then go in.
But that's while you're still cutting, or when you've got a
oh, sorry, I know what you're saying.
Yeah, fine cut. What is it? What stage in the edit are you?
I think we normally it's a pretty solid rough cut at that point.
Yeah.
It's too much of a waste of time otherwise, because you're chopping and changing right up until your kind of fine cut deadline. So and losing scenes, and so it'd just be a nightmare for. I'm sure Patrick has. I probably have cut stuff that you've done in the past, but yeah, ideally it's a kind of locked off cut that you work from.
And sometimes you'll have a screening at a festival and realize actually I would love to adjust that, and even after it's all been mixed, we can go in and do a little bit of work. It's rare that happens, but it does sometimes happen.
And how long would you allow for that process? So you're pretty much picture locked, send it over to Patrick, and how long? Is it a ticking clock then for you? Or?
We did Virunga in 6 weeks, and it was a lot of music because it was 1 hour and 7 minutes or something like that, I think. So you're right in however many minutes that is per week.
Yeah.
But that's approved music, so you're going through all the drafting process as well, and also the mixing. And
so that includes the drafts, 6 weeks. That's
incredible.
It was because of a festival deadline.
The Tribeca deadline.
Yeah. So.
Damn deadlines like that.
And you were saying earlier that you said that 3 drafts was quick for that particular bit, implying that other songs took longer.
In the double digits.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, some particular bits just took forever to nail particular songs, definitely.
And were you aware? Was it a question of you trying to persuade Orlando and Orlando not being convinced, or were you aware that you hadn't quite nailed the essence of it?
Well, I think me and Orlando have a similar. I think we always want the same impact. So if there's something that he thinks isn't working, then something's not working, there's something wrong. And sometimes I'll find my corner and say, like, no, I really think this is like that. And he's like, okay, I understand that point, but you're not addressing this point. And it becomes a dialogue like that. And that's kind of but we're both trying to achieve the same thing. So it's just a kind of chiseling away at it process, and it just takes a little bit longer on some scenes which are trickier emotionally usually than other scenes, I think.
And were there any arguments because there's a lot of music in the film.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a fantastic film. There's a lot of music. Were you ever worried there's too much music in the film?
I think if I'm completely honest, I think by the end of making the film, I had no idea if the film was any good anymore, for all different reasons, not just musically. So yes, is the answer. But and we definitely fought with BritDoc were exec producers on this, and we definitely fought with them a bit about the music. I think they wanted us to tone it down, probably have less, make it a bit less kind of Disney. Was definitely a term that was thrown around. But I think we always wanted to try and make it as mainstream as possible. I think we felt the themes in this film, some of the kind of action sequences and the characters, it could punch a bit more mainstream and attract that sort of audience, and then it was sort of okay to push it a little bit more and have a bit more music in the way that a narrative film would. And I tried very hard to make this as much of a narrative film as I could, even though it's a documentary.
And we talked earlier, just going back to your approach to when and why you use music in this film. Is obviously you were talking before about the emotional palette of giving the park itself a resonance. So there's obviously the emotion, looking for emotion in the music, and just talk through the other motives for you putting music in the film. So I think there's quite a variety.
Okay. So yeah, absolutely emotion, tension. I mean, I guess that's an emotion too, but definitely tension. Driving things forward. So there's definitely parts of the film where it just felt they needed a push, and without music they felt a bit too slow. I mean, I think they're. Yeah. I'm sure there's probably lots more. Just can't think of them.
Yeah, I think in general, just pacing of the film as a whole, and so I think to understand how this a cue over here might be working, you kind of need to see it in context from start to finish. Sometimes it might work really well as a self-contained piece, but in the context of the film, maybe it's not quite gelling with what's around it, and so that's an overall pacing issue. I think that can be tricky sometimes when you're working fast, short deadlines that you. But yeah, I think it's helping the stories, helping clarify things sometimes, like for certain characters. What's
the turning point? What's the big beat?
Yeah.
Well, also identifying with other characters. So every kind of certain characters and certain themes, because there was a lot of in this film. There's an oil company. There's a rebel group. There's lots of different characters, and each one kind of had a subtle theme, which I guess helps identify all the different faces and all the different things, so you kind of know where you are on a kind of a musical level as well.
Yeah, so that's supporting the narrative, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Clarity.
It's always about the characters and through their eyes.
Great. And just going, so you went through that 6-week process. Well, I think we're about to see a clip of. Let's look at a clip of Virunga behind the scenes recording, and then I want to ask you both how that bit works. So you settled on the composition, and then it came down to recording the live elements that you were talking about.
So by this time all the music is set, and we know what all the notes are, and now it's just a matter of getting the orchestrator involved, who's going to help us get all the notes on the page. And in this case, it was a friend of mine, Clarissa Farran, and she's fantastic. She really understood what it was we were going for and what directions to give the players in order to achieve the emotional impact that we were going for. And we showed a few things to the players because I think it's important to get them all excited about it and feel like it's important. And I think hopefully that comes through in the playing as well and the final end product.
Let's take a look. Gosh, that must be an amazing feeling, having all those people play your music, Patrick. Sounds beautiful.
It's what we always look forward to, is that moment, I think. Yeah. I should also mention that I'm a big believer in getting the best studio, the best musicians with the best instruments, because...
who isn't?
but even if that means you get less players, but you have these people that I think it's more valuable.
Less.
Yes, absolutely.
And better quality, the best.
Absolutely.
Less than the best.
And of course, budget factors.
Yeah, so Orlando, how supportive, I mean, obviously here's someone here who seems completely driven to get the best, and how supportive were you of his understanding of the need for the live musician side, to get the best, as he said?
Okay, I'll be completely honest. I don't think I'd ever we'd ever had a live musician work on a track that we'd done before. I was always very happy with the sample music that Pat had made, and the idea of getting a live score, it seemed great, but it also seemed really expensive. And we all know how tight documentary budgets are. But Pat kept saying it really will add something to it. And and then we did it, and it sounded great. I have to admit, the first time I heard it all play through, I was terrified because in some ways I didn't think it sounded as good. but it was actually because I got so used to all the sample music, the hearing, but now I realise that actually it's way more kind of emotional. It's way more gentle. I guess a single note on a real played violin feels sort of fragile and real, and it, on a sample it sort of doesn't. It just feels a lot more kind of clunky.
Yeah, well, let's move on to Ed, because I think you had a really different way of working, didn't you, with J. Ralph? And that, just sort of that partly had to do with logistics, because he was in New York and you were...
Yeah, so Josh works all over the world, but his studio is in New York, and I was based in London the whole time. I quite like to cut my own films as much as possible, so I spent about a year on and off. I mean, the film took 4 years to make, and I was cutting as I went, and then we brought in an editor at the end for 6 weeks or something. So I basically cut to a string out, we brought an editor in, and then got it to fine cut. But as I was putting together the string out, I was using guide track music from films. Into the Wild was the one I basically kind of stole their whole soundtrack, which is the big sort of Eddie Vedder piece, and it's an amazing score. And I became really connected and sort of emotionally attached to that music. And I tend to cut because I do a lot of short films for the Guardian and other places, shorter films that tend to have sort of music from the start to the end. I tend to cut very closely to the music and to the beat, and so I was cutting sequences to hit certain points in the music and certain inflections and stuff. So I have to admit, when we then got Josh on quite late in the process, it was really nerve-wracking because we didn't have the time or the budget to have any drafts, really. We basically gave him the film that was finished and asked him to go away, and I spent hours on Skype talking to him, and I'd only met him once. But he was then going to have to create a score for the whole for the whole film, plus 3 original songs. And I think we may have had like a few tweaks, but that was it. So it was pretty terrifying. Wow. And also the guide music I was giving him, like I gave him a Bob Dylan track and like some pretty, all my favourite music, and was just kind of like, you go and recreate this and do something better. Which is, but Josh is he's such a genius. He's so confident as well that he was just like, yeah, that's fine. I'll do something. It's great.
Amazing. And
and he did.
How long did you give him? How long did he have?
Not long, I don't think.
Not long. It's not long.
I don't know. I don't remember exactly. Probably a month, maybe. I think.
Right. Gosh.
And that's why there weren't many rounds built in of notes,
so
if any.
The draft.
I don't think Josh does drafts, though.
I don't think Josh. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. But I have to admit, I didn't offer any feedback. It was the one part of the process I tend to let micromanage, especially in the first project, and I had my hands in like every step of the way. But with the music, I just kind of backed off a bit. But it was terrifying because the film was cut to all this guide track. I fell in love with the guide track, and then we were handing it off to this guy that I'd met once, and he sent back all this music. And
on the film, did you hear it for the first time when it was actually laid on the film?
Yeah, I did.
Oh my god!
Wow.
Very
trusting.
So what did you when you watched it with the new music? How was that?
It was an interesting experience because certain parts actually narratively worked differently to how they had previously.
Right.
I think he's done an amazing job and an incredible job actually, and I think he lifted the film to another level. But it was certainly terrifying.
So you're saying he saw things in it dramatically that you hadn't necessarily noticed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he had. Because I think also as a director especially, I'm sure Orlando felt this, when you're connected to a project for 3, 4, 5 years, you tend to not be able to see the wood from the trees. And to bring in fresh eyes at every step was amazing, but to bring in at composing stage was great. And I think he found nuances and textures and emotion that I hadn't found before. But it was nerve-wracking, and I then ended up we'd reached pitch lock, and I then went back and re-edited 3 or 4 sequences so that it hit certain beats in his music. There's one sequence, there are some quite long lyrical sequences in the second half of the film, and there's one when they get up to Scotland that was kind of timed perfectly to the music, and there was this kind of big shot of a beautiful silhouetted tree, and it hit the music beat in the guide track. And then when Josh sent over his music, it was kind of like a couple of seconds afterwards, and I kind of freaked out, and I went back in and kind of re-edited that whole sequence to make it fit again. But we also, a bit like you were talking, when we were in the edit, we had a sound designer who our editor had worked with a lot, and throughout the kind of month of editing, every day we would export kind of sections of the film, 10-minute sections of the film, that he would design to that and send them back so that we had them in the edit the next day. And that was really amazing, because I think what we found was that we were able to take a lot of shortcuts, and the sound design ended up doing more work than a line was doing, and so we ended up pulling out a line, and we didn't need it anymore. The sound design was taking us, or telling that part of the story for us in a cleverer, more subtle, more nuanced way. So, and I really liked that interaction. I thought that was fascinating to see how we could actually kind of simplify the cinema verite sense of the film, to strip out more and more dialogue and replace it with sound design and music.
Great, very brave. Let's have a look at one of the, I think we've got one of the guide tracks that you were cutting to before you sent it over. Is that right, Jonsson? Talk about it's the wolf.
Oh yeah, so this was the clip we played earlier when Garnet dives underwater. I'd always scored it to an amazing piece from Into the Wild called The Wolf, which is this kind of epic song, and this is what we gave Josh as a guide track. The interesting thing about that track was it was really the only moment in the film where the music explodes. The rest of the film, the music is consciously very restrained. And one of the fascinating things about working with Josh is that he sometimes in interviews refers to himself as a reducer rather than a producer. And I know that what he means by that is that when he writes tracks, he tends to fill them with lots of different instruments, and then actually the process he takes is stripping back, and he takes out layers and layers and layers of sound until it gets to the point at which he removes one more sound and the whole thing falls apart. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of creative approach, and it's something we ended up taking narratively to the edit as well. We removed a lot of the character introductions and just stripped away a lot of the narrative signposts that were often kind of taught to put into documentary films. So in some way, his music approach actually ended up informing the editorial narrative approach as well. So the chats I was having with him were really, the influence he had on the film wasn't strictly just kind of music based, it was editorial as well, and the way that we were kind of approaching it.
Yeah, I think we've got a clip of him at work, haven't we, J-Ram? Is that right? Have we? Studio, is it pictures?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay, here's the piano. So, did you have, did he...
Ostentatious much?
Is that
It's awesome.
Is that him?
Yeah,
that's some Vanity Fair shoot.
I think it actually is a Vanity Fair.
Yeah. It's brilliant.
But he owns this kind of, I guess he owns it, it's a sort of abandoned warehouse in the Lower East Side. It looked a bit to me like a sort of James Bond villain sort of lair, because there's a massive fish tank in the middle, and but it's incredible, it's really amazing, and there's every instrument you could wish for in there. And there's no natural light, so you kind of go in and it's sort of slightly surreal. You never know what time it is, and you come out like 5 hours later after a lot of whiskey and having chats about the film and stuff.
And he recorded with live musicians, did he?
He did, yeah. I mean, like Orlando, I'd never worked on it. This is my first feature doc, and I'm not really a purist in the sense that I don't personally, I don't care whether, if it sounds the same, I don't mind too much whether it's a sample or a live recording from my point of view, just because, you know, I'd have loved to shoot the thing on an Alexa, but we didn't have the budget, so I'm sort of learning, especially as a young filmmaker, that you can't have it all, and you have to, you know, to pick your battles. But the one thing we did have going for us, I guess, was that the character in the film is a bit of an artisan and a romantic and a poet and a musician, but it's all a bit rough and ready, and we wanted to try and capture that sense of immediacy and the rough and readiness of his life in the music, and I think we simply wouldn't have got that, I don't think, through doing it.
Imperfection is hard, very hard to get with samples, and getting that feeling of the realness and that texture out of samples is tricky. Having said that, it's getting easier. There's a sample producer now called Imperfect Samples who's actually just trying to do exactly that. That's a really, really interesting concept. But yeah.
But I mean, is that so? That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, do you think that there's obviously at the moment when there's sort of, I don't know if it's a tension, but there's certainly there's different things you're getting from the live music to the digital. But do you envisage a time when it's just going to all for those kind of tricks you're just referring to?
I don't think there'll it'll ever be
Without
all.
live musician.
Yeah, I don't think it'll ever be all. But I mean, it's certainly, if you look at the last 30 years and what's happened, you know, in terms of what we're doing now compared to this stuff 20 or 30 years ago, and the ability to have that backwards and forwards, which never used to be there. You know, there was a huge difference in trust in terms placed in the composer from a director when you couldn't demo stuff up because it costs so much to demo stuff up with full live musicians. So, but I don't see a day, and I love working with technology and using everything that's available, and I don't see a day where performance is taken out of it. Performance might just change, but you know.
The other interesting thing, and I'm not sure this, you guys were talking a little bit about maybe having too much music and that being a danger. I think often, especially for younger filmmakers, music can sort of be like a drug. Like you become so used to and so unable to see your footage with fresh eyes that scenes become boring because you've seen them so many times. And I think it's quite easy then to just kind of layer music underneath to make them more interesting because you've watched them 30 times, and I think that can be really dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking from the other side of the fence. I'm constantly, it's interesting that Brit Girls saying the same thing, because one of my main notes often is, can you just take music out, or a lot of music out, because there is a balance, isn't there? There's a balance between the music sort of amplifying the emotion and clarifying the narrative to it trying to attempt to prop something which isn't there up, or you're not actually making the story clear enough in itself. Yeah.
I've definitely been guilty of that in the past, maybe even with Virunga, but no. I mean, it's a really, really good point actually, and it can actually slow down the film enormously and actually pull out all of the emotion if you over music it. And over push the emotion in the music if you're not careful.
It was interesting. Walter, I know it's all caught it. Maybe it's on the website, but Walter Murch, the editor, Apocalypse Now, and he cut this. He was here 2 years ago. He did an amazing workshop. Was anyone here? Did anyone see it? Because he just cut Particle Fever. This is a documentary about 5 years of the Hadron Collider, and he was really talking about the favour of paring the music down, doing the whole process, but then really stripping out the last bit. Anyway, I'd recommend it. He was interesting about his views on music. Budget-wise, let's just move on briefly. We're going to open up to questions in about 5-10 minutes' time. So if you have any, we will have time for questions. So this is just a brief section, I think, really. But just, I mean, how much did the total music budget cost on each of your projects?
Pat, do you remember what it was in the end?
I think for studio and musicians, it was just north of £10,000. So I think it was 12,000 or something like that.
We pulled a lot of. I mean, I know that's still a lot of money, but we pulled an enormous amount of favours and tried to get, because there's a whole social side to this film and there's a campaign that runs alongside it, and so we tried to get everyone involved in that to help.
And then
lower
the plus
the
part of that is they've got no clearance issues, have you? That's it, which is a huge consideration, which obviously many filmmakers, it's amazing how many films get stuck when they haven't realised that they've got to clear things worldwide, and I guess you probably get approaches from people because of that sometimes at last minute, but we've certainly had to nurse filmmakers through that realisation that the BBC clearance is UK only, And what about you, Ed?
I've no idea. I don't know, but mainly because I never really purposely got involved in any of the budget. I don't actually know what our budget for the film was, let alone how much we spent on music, because I'm not sure I wanted to. Actually.
Yeah, well, Simon, we were working with Simon. Ed was working with Simon Chin, who's obviously super experienced at pulling the deals.
I think he probably felt safer not to tell me, just so I would kind of ask for stuff and be told yes or no, which and more often than not told yes. But so I don't know. I'm not sure. But Josh did. I think Josh seems to be very well connected, so he seemed to rope in some friends of his, and I think pulled a few deals. Yeah.
But just going on that doesn't sound, your 10, 20, 12 does not sound too much to me. And there are ways also of recouping that, aren't there? Because you guys went on, didn't you? It's released, isn't it?
No, not yet, but it's in the process of
being released. Because that is and how does that work? Just talk us through. Is that you doing that, or have you approached?
Well, it'll be a label that releases it, and then it's just another way to kind of, well, in the case of Virunga, just getting more people aware of it, and just keeping things going and in the public kind of consciousness, I guess.
So it's almost part of the outreach of the film is the...
For Ring it is, yeah. But of course also it's a way to kind of recoup, like you say, some of the expenses, and for composers that's a big part of. We have our upfront fees, and then we have the back end as well.
Which is the royalties.
Royalties, you know, if it gets placed in a trailer, or if it gets used in a program, or
Pat's being very modest here. He's actually donating all of the money that comes back from the album to the park. So so he's not going to actually recoup any money from that. But
of course, yeah. But you know, it is another way to recoup.
Yeah, and Garnet's Gold is available commercially.
It is, yeah. It's on iTunes.
And how did that process? Was that J. Ralph?
Yeah, that was Josh.
Right. Okay.
So, yeah, I'm not sure exactly how the licensing of that worked out, but interesting enough, after it went out on the BBC, we got a lot of emails about the film, but a lot of them were to do with trying to track down the music and to find out where there's a song at the end, an original song with Liza Minnelli and Wynton Marsalis, and a lot of people wanted to try and find out.
Yeah,
what
that was
an
astonishing song. So how did that happen?
Garnet spends a lot of, when I first met Garnet, before he went on this mad adventure to find gold, I found him in a pub singing and dancing, and he's a sort of amateur singer, I guess. And there are a couple of pubs in London that still have live music a couple of times a week, and there's someone who plays the piano and people sing old sea shanties and things. And Garnet, one of Garnet's favourite songs was, he loves the kind of Liza Minnelli-esque kind of ballads and stuff. So Josh thought that at the end of the film, we have this slightly abstract sequence where Garnet is performing a magic trick, and he dresses himself up sort of like Harry Houdini, and his friends lock him up and put him in a box. It all sounds a bit abstract, it's quite hard to explain, but Josh thought it was rather amazing to try and get one of Garnet's heroes, Liza, to actually sing an original song about Garnet. And he managed to somehow. So we had Wynton Marsalis playing trumpet and Liza singing. And yeah, it was amazing. It was a strangely kind of disconnected experience because I never met Liza or Wynton, but there's this song that's in our film, and she's sort of singing words that are actually written about someone I have a drink with every week.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's really, and
amazing.
for Garnet especially, it's absolutely bizarre. But yeah.
But he liked the song?
Oh, he loves it, and I feel very privileged to be able to kind of, you know, have their amazing work in the film.
Fantastic. Should we just hear a few clips from a montage of Garnet's Gold from the...
Yeah, that song's in there. There's 4 songs from it. There's little clips for it.
Okay, should we take a listen? Fantastic.
It's interesting hearing this because there's such sort of weird, sort of eclectic mixture of sounds and tones and stuff.
Cool.
No wonder it's a soundtrack album.
Makes you want to go buy the soundtrack
cool.
right away.
Yeah.
No, well, I mean, we know really for both, you know, just it's amazing just hearing the snippets again here, and just, you know, they're both astonishing soundtracks and, you know, beautiful work. Now listen, we've only got 5 minutes for questions. Has anyone, this lady at the front, who'd like to ask a question?
Hi, I just wondered when you come to looking at the score, how aware are you of the music leading the narrative, and you know, how do you have discussions about how to get the balance of that right?
So sorry, can you just repeat the question again?
Yeah, about getting the balance of the score not leading the narrative too much, so that you're not, you know, sort of dictating really to an audience how to feel. Particularly if it's quite an emotional subject matter or scene, that you don't want to sort of do the work for the audience with the music.
Sorry, you jump in.
Well, so I mean, it's a really good question, and actually sometimes we were purposely going counterintuitive with the tone of the music, because otherwise you are sort of guilty of slightly sort of gilding the lily potentially, and kind of. You know, the other thing, we were talking about silence, you know, Josh, our composer, was actually the one person, or he was one of, when we showed Josh the film, he actually said, no, we need less music. So it was interesting to have a composer to say, actually, look, we're trying to do too much with the music, we actually need to do less, and with the bits that we decide to score, let's, you know, make sure we get those right. I don't know,
I think what you actually just told us, like if it's reflected back to you, that's perfect communication that a director can give to a a composer in terms of just having that open discussion about that's something that you're concerned about, and you might have got those concerns through an edit by watching a piece with a certain reference track over and over again, then feeling this is way too heavy-handed, and then being able to just communicate that to the composer, I think.
I'd also say it's often led by the scene, actually. I think it becomes heavy-handed if the scene is already really sad and then you add a wailing violin. I mean, that tends to be really clunky, whereas you might get away with like a wailing violin if the scene isn't inherently sad. Maybe it's just some wide shots of, in our case, of a big park. You're not seeing something really sad playing out, but then the music can be pushed a little more to hint at some sort of deeper sadness in there.
Rajesh at the back.
Just one for the composers. All the clips we've seen have come either from a sort of, I mean, I'm not a musician, but to my mind, they're either descended from a Western classical tradition or a jazz or a modern Western tradition. What's your experience and advice on if you're trying to mix musical traditions? Say, for example, you're trying to mix, say, Latin American or South Asian or different types of musical traditions because of the subject matter. Have you got experience of that, and what?
Well, I mean, in the case of Virunga, we use some Congolese instruments, but in a very subtle way. Some instruments that I'm very interested in that come from the region, but obviously it's a very Western score, and we kind of made a conscious decision not to make it a Congolese sounding score, and we wanted it to be quite universal and to have be played from the character's perspective in the way that we knew how and the language that we knew how, and so for this particular film we didn't go in that direction too much. But I can absolutely see it working, and I'm fascinated by music from all over the world. So
I think you just immerse yourself in it, don't you?
If it's honest, then I think it's that's less important. Maybe the geography of a place. I don't know.
I think there's certainly times where for whatever reason you're asked to have some sort of ethnic or instruments that you might not be used to using and not understanding. And I think there is a reasonable amount of study as a composer if that's something that you're not familiar with, that you just need to do. And whether that's through just listening to a whole heap of things and then trying to write it, or studying scores and that side of things, I think there's definitely a use in that. There's also a huge use in employing someone as well, another composer who is very familiar with that, and then collaborating with them. And I really enjoy that process. So yeah, I guess there's different projects will have different approaches.
That's what I was going to ask. But so that process of collaboration is something that isn't too uncomfortable? Because
I personally thrive on it. I love working with other composers and getting ideas, but different composers have different methods and different things that they're comfortable with.
I agree completely, and I think that's part of what inviting live musicians in can help with, as well as that if you bring someone who has knowledge that you don't have yourself, then they can really bring something to the table, and you can have a dialogue and respond to whatever's interesting in the thing that they're doing. You're casting people who can act in your piece.
Yeah, and recording traditional instruments. And I remember I had an oud player for a project, and I actually just wrote some things wrong that he couldn't do, and I obviously hadn't done all the study I should have. But they were able to then help and bring it round to something that really, really worked. So yeah, absolutely.
I think we've got any more questions? I think we're running out of time anyway, actually. Okay, yeah, okay. Well, I think that you're here, aren't you? But anyway, can I just say, I mean, it's been fantastic. Thank you for being so generous with all your information. That's Brendan and Patrick and Ed and Orlando. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.